Hi, everyone. My name is Maria del Pilar Blanco. I'm hosting today's third event of the Caribbean Studies Network. I'm going to open this seminar by saying that it is an immense pleasure to welcome Mónica Jiménez and Marisol LeBrón to virtual Oxford, digital Oxford, and to Digital Torch. It's stupendous to be able to hear cutting edge research on the Caribbean and today on Puerto Rico, particularly in a university that has very often turned a blind eye to this region and this island. And thank you especially to Michael Joseph and to Will Ghosh for their vision in setting up a Caribbean Studies Network that can help remedy this void and this silence. And I want to thank Torch from the bottom of my heart for being the best home for this network. Today is a really interesting time to be discussing colonialism, police corruption, and abuse in Puerto Rico. The island has just had its elections this past week, an election that included another referendum on the island status, yet another one, 52% for statehood, 48% against. And the seems to have gone by a very slim margin to the pro-statehood party once more, and this after the events of 2019 that we will perhaps discuss today. And on Saturday, we learned about the fate of Donald Trump, whose racist attitude toward Puerto Rican subjects is only the latest example in a long colonial history, 120-year history. Anyway, I'm really excited to be hosting this. People will be coming in. But I want to introduce our two guests. Mónica Jiménez is assistant professor in the African and African Diaspora Studies Department at the University of Texas at Austin. A Juris Doctor, her work explores the intersections of race, law, and colonialism in the history of US imperial expansionism in the Caribbean and Latin America. She is at work on a book manuscript called American State of Exception, Race, and Law in the Making of Puerto Rico. She has published fascinating work on Puerto Rican nationalism in the first half of the 20th century, when the island's position within the US Constitution was being designed, obviously from outside the island, and also the role that race plays within that history. Mónica is also a Canto Mundo poet. This is an organization that fosters the work of Latinx poets. Some of her brilliant work has appeared in places like Small Aches, and we are big fans of that impressive venue here. So please, I invite everybody to read Mónica's poetry. And we also have Marisol LeBrón, who is assistant professor in the Department of Mexican American and Latino Studies at the University of Texas at Austin. She's the author of Policing Life and Death, Race, Violence, and Resistance in Puerto Rico, which was published by the University of California Press last year. With Yarimar Bonilla, she edited this wonderful essay collection, Aftershocks of Disaster, Puerto Rico Before and After the Storm, which was also published in 2019 by Haymarket Books, and you can read Mónica's writing in this book as well. Marisol is finishing a short bilingual book entitled Against Puerto Rico, Lessons from the Verano Boricua, which covers the anti-colonial political activism and the events in Puerto Rico in the summer of 2019. Marisol is one of the founders of the Puerto Rico Syllabus, and that's PuertoRicoSyllabus.com or hashtag Puerto Rico Syllabus. This is a teaching and thinking resource on the Puerto Rican debt crisis. It's an excellent resource and a model to follow, particularly at this time of virtual interconnectivity. So please, everybody, explore the Puerto Rico Syllabus if you haven't. I'm so thankful to you both for being here today at 9 a.m. on an Austin Monday, no less, and for sharing the work that is emerging out of your immensely exciting collaboration. You're leading the way and showing us the many optics through which to read the Puerto Rican past, its present, but very crucially, its possible futures. So just for the audience, Mónica and Marisol will speak roughly during the first half of the hour, after which I'll be taking questions. I'll come on back into view. People, whoever wants to ask questions, you can type in your messages in the Q&A box and I will be fielding them. And we have a large audience today, so bear with us. We will get as many questions in as we can, and we will finish at the hour. Now, without further ado, Marisol, Mónica, take it.
Thank you so much, and thank you for the invitation to be here today. This is so exciting because this is one of Monica and I's kind of first official writing collaborations, which I think we've been plotting for since before I got to UT, so for a while now, and it's really nice to have that kind of underway and to be able to start sharing it with folks. So what we're going to share today is from a work in progress. So we're really excited to be in conversation with you all and to hear your thoughts. We've kind of distilled down this paper that we're working on right now, which is dealing with questions of colonialism and police corruption in Puerto Rico. So I'm going to kind of provide some of the general framing and context, and then we'll pass it to Mónica for to share one of the examples that we look at in the paper. So I'm going to go ahead and just start reading. So the Puerto Rico Police Department, PRPD, has long had a reputation as one of the most corrupt and violent police forces under US jurisdiction. Tales abound in the media, as well as local lore, of police officers engaging in robberies, kidnappings for ransom, extortion rackets, and targeted assassinations. During the 1970s and 1980s, the PRPD was accused of harboring police units that engaged in routine harassment and violence, including the murder of political activists and rivals. The entrapment and execution of two young pro-independence activists at Cerro Maravilla on July 25th, 1978, led to a series of investigations that revealed the extent to which the PRPD's intelligence division had been engaging in politicized forms of surveillance, harassment, and violence against thousands of citizens. In response to political and public pressure, actions were taken to reform the agency in an effort to root out corruption and depoliticize police work. Decades later, the success of these reform efforts have largely proven ineffective. And we can think about, for instance, the 2011 DOJ kind of report about the police, the Puerto Rico Police Department that proclaimed it one of the most corrupt and abusive police departments within US jurisdiction, and the kind of subsequent consent decree that came out of that is still largely unfulfilled. So in the longer essay that this talk draws from, we make two interrelated arguments regarding corruption and Puerto Rico's policing apparatus. First, we challenge the notion that Puerto Rico's police are in some way uniquely corrupt or more corrupt than other policing agencies. Instead, drawing on the work of policing scholars, we understand corruption as an intrinsic element of police work writ large. In other words, the PRPD is corrupt because policing itself is corrupt. Assertions that police corruption is something unique to the institutional culture of the PRPD traffic in colonial stereotypes about morally lax Puerto Rican subjects, and ignore the ways that policing and corruption are intertwined and, as we argue, mutually dependent within colonial capitalist contexts. Recognizing that corruption is central to policing in all contexts, we seek to explain the conditions that shape the specific nature, scope, and expressions of police corruption in Puerto Rico. We argue that the structures of colonial capitalism in the archipelago have deeply shaped the corruption of the PRPD. Colonial capitalism's authoritarian mode of governance, we assert, requires, tolerates, and normalizes police corruption in order to function. We understand colonial capitalism as a structuring corruption, one that is dependent upon the project of pacification and the race-class differentiation embedded within the core of policing. So in the paper, we focus on two examples from the early 20th century, and this is where I'm very appreciative to Mónica for pushing me out of my kind of late 20th century lens. So we focus on two examples that illustrate the constitutive role of corruption within the colonial capitalist state's policing apparatus. First, we focus on the role of the insular police in disciplining workers and acting as a strike-breaking force during the massive labor unrest that marked the 1930s. And this is what Mónica will be talking about in her part. The role of the insular police in violently repressing organized labor and other working class activists illustrates their inherently political role within colonial capitalist order. The other example that we examine in the larger paper is that of Jesus Maria González Torres and his appeals to the Secretary of War to address the insular police's culture of violence and corruption. The denunciations made by González Torres ultimately went unaddressed because the victims were perceived by both local and federal authorities as sexually deviant and troublesome Negroes who, by their very presence, were at war with the police. De González Torres' calls for accountability and reform not only fell on deaf ears, but led to efforts to further discredit and criminalize him and his community, illustrate the ways in which corruption serves to protect police power and its ability to, in the words of Mark Neocolis, fabricate social order by reproducing the race, class, and spatial hierarchies that facilitate colonial rule and capitalist exploitation. So the criminologist Maurice Punch notes that, quote, corruption is an inherent and near universal facet of policing, end quote. So what explains this corruption and it's the ways in which it's inherent to police work? The answer lies in the flexible and seemingly limitless scope of power that the state has endowed in its policing apparatus in order to fabricate, maintain, and enforce order. In 1891, political scientist John W. Burgess called police power the dark continent of our jurisprudence, remarking that it acted as, quote, the convenient repository of everything for which our juristic classifications can find no other place, end quote. In a similar vein, the philosopher Walter Benjamin has called police power formless, likening it to a ghostly presence in the life of civilized states, while Giorgio Agamben has noted the similarities between police and a black hole. For his part, Michel Foucault went so far as to posit that the police includes everything. Through these attempts to grasp at the edges of police power, it becomes apparent that the police do much more than address crime. Rather, we see that the police power is fungible precisely because police are expected to respond to the ever-shifting needs of capital and the state. The introduction of politics into police work is often understood as a corrupting force. But the argument that we make in our paper is that that's a fundamental misunderstanding of the nature of policing, because policing is always at its core political and is always responding to political will. So policing serves to produce and preserve power relations shaped by the political, economic, and social relations of the time and place. In the case of Puerto Rico, then we see that policing responds to the colonial capitalist imperatives of both the local and federal state, as well as larger kind of core of economic elites. Police then are fundamentally political actors, as their actions are driven by the dominant political will of the time and context, as well as their own desire to hold on to their exceptional powers. Which include discretion over the use of violence, as well as their social societal status. So this has been true for the policing apparatus in Puerto Rico since the inception of the Puerto Rico Insular Police. So this is what we're going to focus on for the rest of the talk, is the kind of precursor to the PRPD, which is the Insular Police. And we understand the Insular Police as a force that was designated first and foremost as an instrument of US colonialism. So in the early 20th century, the Puerto Rico Insular Police was at the center of doling out violence in the service of US empire. With the imposition of US governance in Puerto Rico, the police force was centralized and placed under the control of the US appointed governor. The police chief, usually a mainland American with former military training, was appointed by the governor and answered directly to him. So did not answer, much like our current system, to the will of the people, right, of local kind of civilians. Though direct military rule lasted only 2 years after the beginning of the US colonial period, military control over the Insular Police lasted over 50 years until 1956. So police chiefs, much like governors, the governors who appointed them, arrived believing in the US's civilizing mission through tutelage. Force would emerge as a key tool of Americanization efforts, and the police played an outsized role in molding Puerto Ricans into proper subjects of empire. So the insular police were highly politicized and served to consolidate US rule and advance US political and capital interests in Puerto Rico. The police achieved these goals through force, intimidation, and perhaps most importantly, during this period, the expansion of politicized surveillance capabilities. So during the 1930s, which is the period we're going to focus on, we see that the insular police, in collaboration with the US Military Intelligence Division and a nascent Federal Bureau of Investigation, FBI, all had a hand in implementing a widespread surveillance program that monitored so-called subversive activities. These subversive activities ranged from organized political events, like even including people not just organizing these events, but attending these events, of left-leaning and pro-independence parties to student protests, labor stoppages, and strikes, which is what we'll be talking about today. The surveillance and reporting mission of these law enforcement agencies in Puerto Rico, as should be kind of apparent from this brief overview, had very, very little to do with combating crime, right? And everything to do with advancing US political and economic interests. So we actually see that most of what the police do, or the police spend very little of their time actually combating crime, although during this time period, we see them criminalizing a wide range of subsistence and survival kind of strategies that Puerto Ricans were using to negotiate the effects of US colonialism. So the overtly politicized nature of policing and law enforcement in Puerto Rico during the early 20th century provided countless benefits to powerful elites, both in and outside of the archipelago, at the same time that it led to distrust and tension between many ordinary Puerto Ricans and the police. So throughout the historical record, we see instances of Puerto Rican police exceeding their power in order to harass residents or get away with criminal activities. Of course, it could be argued, as it was at the time and as it is today, that this police force is made up of Puerto Rican, that this police force was made up of Puerto Ricans and not acting as an oppressive force on behalf of the US, right? So the fact that it was not kind of mainland US officials, but actually, native kind of born Puerto Ricans, right? So that they weren't necessarily kind of acting as this top-down method, right? And that instead they're abusing their power for personal gain or amusement, right? So that's often the argument that we see when it comes to kind of discussions of Puerto Rican police. It's not about colonialism, it's actually about their own internal kind of corruptions. So while this may be true in part, as we've discussed, it's undeniable that these men were also US agents trained by the US military to protect US interests and quell dissent. The charge of the police to maintain and enforce the dominant economic and political order, which in this case of Puerto Rico is colonial capitalism rooted in racialized exploitation and extraction, is what we identify as a structuring corruption that shapes policing. So as Jose Aquiles urges, we must understand that corruption is not about individual acts of grit or criminal enrichment. Rather, corruption functions as a form of governance within the context of colonial capitalist power relations. Colonial capitalism is an inherently corrupt system because it's a rigged game. The outcome is always extraction and plunder, and it's always the already powerful who come out on top. And it is policing and the corruption that it breeds that ensures that the house always wins. Thus, as Joaquin Villanueva points out, during the early 20th century, quote, abuses of power by US politicians, bankers, planters, and businessmen were a common practice largely unpunished by colonial authorities, while the insular police sought to discipline the popular classes through constant surveillance and coercion, end quote. The discipline imposed on Puerto Ricans by the insular police was meant to ensure that they acted like good colonial subjects by staying quiet regarding the injustices of colonial rule, all while breaking their backs to generate profits for US and Puerto Rican elites. Policing may always function as a corrupt disciplinary force, shaping the everyday lives of Puerto Ricans, particularly those who are racially, economically, or politically marginalized. But that doesn't mean that the police power met little resistance as it was deployed in the territory. Instead, we see the Puerto Ricans constantly push back on the expansive and exceptional nature of police power by pointing out its inherent corruption and that of the violent colonial capitalist order that it preserved. And I will now pass it to my wonderful collaborator.
Thank you, Marisol. Thank you, Maria, for the invitation, and it's a pleasure to be here today. I'm going to share my screen for perhaps all of the presentation, but mostly because I want to be able to, for you all to see the sort of geographic landscape of Puerto Rico. I'll be talking about specific towns and cities, so so you all who might not be as familiar with Puerto Rico have a sense of what I'm talking about. And just to sort of orient you, here, of course, is the Atlantic, Caribbean, and Puerto Rico between Dominican Republic and the kind of smaller Virgin Islands. And Puerto Rico, of course, is an archipelago. So it is this central island and these two smaller islands, Vieques and Culebra. And I point that out because some of the labor strike activity that takes place in the 1930s actually takes place in Vieques. But Vieques, even among Puerto Rican historiography, is often sort of marginalized. So I just wanted to kind of orient you guys and to reiterate what Marisol was explaining, that the inceptions of the Puerto Rico Insular Police was one born out of a militarization and a sort of training in preserving US interest. So not only were the Insular Police trained by the military, but they were also trained by US police, so that the government would bring police captains from, for example, Chicago and New York to train the police force in Puerto Rico. So all of this to say that the kind of logic, the overarching logic of the Insular Police in this early 20th century moment that we're thinking about was very much in keeping and maintaining US colonial interests. So as Marisol mentioned, the police were often invoked as a strike-breaking force and as a force that was used to maintain plantation order in the service of plantation owners, mostly absentee US-based landowners, corporate landowners, and a Puerto Rican elite. And so as early as 1905, so just a few years after the US sort of colonial project in Puerto Rico begins, the police are called out to break a strike in the sugar district. So this sort of police as strike breaking, as labor organizing force begins immediately. Okay, but the 1930s, which is the period that we're most concerned with, of course, is a period of upheaval sort of globally, and certainly in the Caribbean, and certainly in places like Puerto Rico and Guyana and Cuba that are sugar-based economies. The Great Depression obviously upends the kind of economic order of the world, and certainly of the US. And for Puerto Rico, which is heavily reliant on the US market, this means that the majority of sugar that is produced no longer has a market. So the US creates these policies to basically disincentivize the growing of sugar and the importation of sugar from Puerto Rico. And so all of this works to create instability for labor and as well as just a shrinking sort of economic power, right? And their laborers' ability to survive, essentially. So you have this instances of starvation and malnutrition are on the rise in the 30s, as well as just a general deterioration of health and living conditions across the island. And in particular in the agricultural sectors and among Puerto Ricans who depend on seasonal labor and sugar labor in particular. This is kind of happening across sectors in Puerto Rico. I'm going to focus on sugar for my talk. And again, I'll have the map up because most of the sugar sector lies along the coasts of the island, of the central island. And many of the places that we're talking about are down here on this sort of southern plain, southern coast, which were traditionally the places where plantations had existed in the Spanish colonial time, plantations that were based in, that were operated with enslaved labor. So that at this point, when we're talking about who is sort of in the spaces and who these laborers are, they are by and large the descendants of enslaved labor. So that also inserts, as Marisol mentioned, a racialized dynamic to this policing and this control of labor. So in response to the growing desperation that Puerto Ricans felt in the 1930s, in September of 1933, sugar workers on the eastern coast of Puerto Rico attempted to bring production to a halt in protest of low wages and corporate policies that paid workers in company script rather than cash. These initial attempts at protest led to fierce confrontations with police and at least one riot with one death and many injured. Another attempt at a Puerto Rico-wide strike took place in December of 1933, and with that strike moving out into the larger sugar plantations across Puerto Rico. On January 5th, 1934, the Federación Libre de Trabajadores, the Free Federation of Labor, or FLT, a workers' union with ties to the American Federation of Labor, and whose political arm was the Socialist Party, entered into a collective bargaining agreement with sugar employers. This marked the first time that the FLT signed a contract on behalf of all sugar workers in the territory with the Sugar Producers Association. This agreement mostly benefited employers while leaving many workers' demands unaddressed. Most importantly, the demand for higher wages and for payment in cash rather than in script. As a result, most workers rejected the agreement, and by January 10th, 14,267 sugar workers were on strike. Sugar workers, I'm sorry, my cat is, of course, meowing to get out of my office because I'm in the middle of talking. Excuse me. Oh, I'm so sorry. As we all live in these COVID times and our pets are as demanding of our time as everything else. So apologies. So by January 10th, over 14,000 sugar workers were on strike, and they were protesting mostly low wages and employer practices that meant that they were beholden to employers and did not have a freedom of mobility. They were also protesting the FLT and the FLT's leaders who were working with the plantation owners. And labor saw themselves as being sort of left out of that equation and not being taken care of. And they were also protesting government policies, so US policies that created this environment that benefited plantation owners and really disenfranchised and impoverished Puerto Rican labor. So shortly after the start of the strike, sugar workers from the city of Guayama, and if you remember, that's on that southern coast in Puerto Rico, the south central part of Puerto Rico, called upon Nationalist Party leader Pedro Albizu Campos to lead a strike. And Albizu Campos is a sort of mythological figure at this point in Puerto Rican history, but at the time, this was sort of at the height of his powers, and he was a staunch advocate for Puerto Rican independence, did not believe that the US should have any role in Puerto Rico, and believed that sort of corporate capitalism had left Puerto Rico impoverished, undeveloped, and beholden to US interests. So when workers sought Albizu Campos' support because they believed that the Socialist Party were allied with the FLT in support of the agreement with the plantation owners. So this was an unprecedented move in Puerto Rican labor history because previous strikes had relied on the political support of the socialist and communist parties and had focused on wages and labor policies, but had not taken an anti-imperial tone. And the introduction of Albizu Campos into the 1934 dispute meant that workers were ready to publicly and politically link their labor disputes with US imperialism and oppression. Furthermore, it meant that the previously established rules of strike and protest did not apply. Workers were looking outside of the FLT and the Socialist Party for allies in their struggles. On January 12th, Albizu Campos traveled from the southern city of Ponce to the town of Guayama and held a rally at which 6,000 striking workers were present. A few days earlier, about 500 workers had attended a rally with a labor organizer from the FLT. Once workers at the rally understood that the FLT was not interested in listening to their demands, but instead was urging them to accept the agreement and return to work, the majority of workers began to protest and criticize the organizers and the agreement. Police arrived at the scene of the protest and removed 400 laborers from the assembly hall, preventing them from voicing their demands or concerns to the labor representatives who were present. Despite the fact that Albizu Campos became involved in the strike at the request of sugar workers themselves, the FLT, the Socialist Party, plantation owners, and the US government pointed to his status as a politician and not a labor organizer in order to delegitimize his involvement in the strike. So government and labor organizers had often blamed outside agitators for inciting strikes and protests as a way to undermine worker demands. Workers were mere pawns of outside agitators rather than individuals with legitimate and real demands and concerns about their labor and their bodies. This, of course, is a well-worn narrative and one that is still deployed today to delegitimize protest across the globe. In response to Albizu Campos's involvement in the strike, the FLT held meetings at the various striking plantations. And in these meetings, especially meetings across the northern coast of Puerto Rico, the FLT was able to persuade some of the striking workers to accept the agreement and return to work. These meetings were marked by heavy police presence, meant to intimidate sugar workers into returning to the fields and to prohibit any outside agitators from speaking to workers. In one meeting held in Fajardo, which is on the eastern coast, the northeastern coast, 5 members of a special police force trained in the maintenance of public order during protests and strikes were present. During the meeting, organizer Jose Salva informed the workers that police were there to, quote, maintain public order. However, workers knew that police were really there to ensure that the members of the Nationalist Party and other activists were not able to, quote, manipulate the workers. Amidst growing strike activities across Puerto Rico and workers' enthusiasm for the leadership of Albizu Campos, the FLT held a meeting in Yabucoa on the southeastern coast. On January 9th, the newspaper El Dia published a report written by politician Cayetano Coricucci, who was an opponent of Albizu Campos. He said, quote, "The agitation in that town is tremendous, and it is headed by Senor Pedro Albizu Campos, who the police are afraid to arrest, despite the many entreaties to the police chief and Governor Horton to do so." In response to Albizu Campos's presence and worker interest in his rhetoric and in his leadership, the FLT warned workers that if they did not sign on to the labor agreement and return to work, the FLT was prepared to hire others to replace the striking workers. So this was, of course, unprecedented because the FLT represented workers, and never before had they threatened to hire scabs to fill in for labor so that labor would return to work. So, but of course, those threats only further angered and frustrated workers who felt that they were not being listened to. And the situation was so charged that the usual dynamics among organizers, workers, and politicians was completely turned upside down. And this was in part due to the presence of Albizu Campos as the leader of the strike. When workers sought him out, they broke with the established dynamics of past strikes. They threw their lot in with the Nationalist Party rather than the Socialists, and they sent the FLT and Socialists scrambling for ways to maintain control over the workers and their interests. Unprecedented poverty and hunger led desperate workers to break with the status quo. Laborers were enraged that the FLT was not advocating for their best interests, and they sought out other ways to voice their discontent. Albizu Campos was only too happy to oblige workers in the call for support and leadership. He genuinely sympathized with the plight of the Puerto Rican worker and saw their situation as a logical conclusion of US imperialism, which was concerned with turning out profits and with little regard for workers. The fact that the strike also gave him a larger platform from which to denounce US imperialism and argue for Puerto Rican independence was an added benefit to the nationalist leader. As the strike continued throughout January of 1934, workers' exhaustion and hunger led many to accede to the FLT's agreement and return to work. The FLT, politicians, the government, and police all applied pressure to break the strike. Acting Governor Horton called on police and local judges to, quote, "investigate and immediately take before the courts of justice any person who evidence tended to show committed defamation against labor organizers." Horton's call for the criminalization of what amounted to political speech was a response to Albizu Campos's denunciations of labor organizers, plantation owners, and the government. And not surprisingly, the governor's call for greater arrest for defamation had an immediate and chilling effect on worker protests. By January 24th, 1934, only about 1,000 workers remained on strike throughout the islands. And as the month wore on, workers from various plantations accepted the agreement and returned to work. However, small strikes continued throughout the sugar sector as workers claimed their employers were not meeting the terms of the agreement. Workers in Guanica and Humacao held work stoppages due to disputes concerning work start times and wages. And despite workers' efforts to continue the strike and have their demands for greater wages and better conditions met, by the early days of February 1934, exhaustion, lack of income, and state pressure led to the sugar workers to return to the field. So this strike really lasted about a month and a half. Though the general strike of 1933-1934 was ultimately unsuccessful, worker resentment and frustration had not dissipated, and disenchantment with labor policies only continued to grow. Between 1934 and 1935, between 50,000 and 60,000 laborers went on strike. And between 1936 and 1937, 13,000 workers went on strike. The continued decline in the agricultural sector resulted in the growth of strikes in other employment areas throughout the turbulent decade of the 1930s. And as worker discontent grew and Puerto Ricans began calling for an end to the extractivist labor practices of US colonialism, the US government responded by deploying the force of the insular police to keep workers in line and to quell protests and dissent. Thank you.
Right, so I'm coming back because as I said to participants, thank you so much first, Marisol and Mónica, for this incredible paper, which connects so many ideas about the Puerto Rican history, long history, continued history of colonial capitalism and its connections to the work of the labor movements and the way that the state, which has, with the assistance of so many different bodies in the US, FBI, et cetera, have worked to police all these efforts to mobilize a population. And this is fascinating. I think it's really going to open up a lot of important questions from our audience. And now I turn to you, audience, and I cannot see you, but I can see your names. If you have any questions, you should enter them in the Q&A box, which is at the bottom of the screen. Now, I wonder if I could start. You know, you have focused your presentation here on the 1930s, but you also kind of backtrack a little bit to the beginning of the relationship with the United States. And one opening question that I had for you was, because I actually have never thought about focalizing my attention on the police. I just feel like it's just this big one blob. And I love the way that you guys are like really working on that aspect. Now, how does this happen when bodies meet and, you know, in a relationship that is one of force? And I was just wondering how much of this is inherited, how much of this apparatus is inherited from the pre-existing Spanish colonial policing bodies. So that's my first question. And then I'm going to start reading the questions from the audience, which are starting to come in.
Mónica, do you want to start? Because I feel like yeah, go for it.
Yeah, so just a little background on how Marisol and I get to this project, which is that I did all this research in early 20th century policing, and I was really intrigued by what was happening. And in my research, I couldn't find much secondary material during this time period, but I found Marisol's sort of contemporary material, and I was like, we should think about this together. But to your question, no, when the US comes in, they pretty much dismantle what had existed. And they kind of they gerrymander the districts, I guess, to create sort of policing districts to suit their interest. And they greatly increase the police force, as well as militarizing it. So, training it in military tactics, arming it with sort of, weapons that at the time, were the kind of, best and most advanced weapons. And then eventually in the 1930s, this period that we're concerned about, the governor and the chief of police actually invest in automatic weapons. So this is the sort of moment where you see like this automation of police violence through automatic weapons in response to nationalism, in particular, in response to great unrest that's happening in this time period.
And I would just add, like, although we can understand like the US government coming in as a kind of under colonial rule and wiping out the kind of structure of policing that existed under Spanish rule. The thing that does run through, right, and I think this is part of what we're trying to get at in the paper, is that the logics of policing remain the same, right? So under Spanish rule, as much as under US rule, right, it's about controlling racialized labor, right? It's about kind of ensuring the kind of smooth functioning of a extractive form of colonial capitalism, right? And so that piece remains, right? And so I think for us, that's the part that we're trying to kind of hold on to in a sense, right? To say like, there are things that are very specific about the case of Puerto Rico, right? And then there are things that are not, right? And in some ways, the purpose of policing we can understand as something that kind of cuts across numerous kind of contexts and time periods, although it shifts like with context and in given historical periods, right? We can understand that there's a core to what the function of police power is, which at its core is about maintaining these kind of social relations that are grounded in colonialism and grounded in capitalism, or grounded in colonialism as well as kind of racialized labor exploitation, right? And so that for us becomes this kind of like strategy to get out of this way in which the Puerto Rico Police Department becomes exceptional because of its colonial status, right? So the kind of ways in which colonial status becomes not the reason why there's corruption, right? In terms of explaining like policing serves this kind of larger, what we're calling a structuring corruption of colonial rule, right? But that it becomes about the colonial subject is morally lax, right? So Puerto Rican police officers can't help themselves because Puerto Ricans as colonial subjects and as subjects in need of tutelage are inherently morally lax, are inherently corrupt, right? And the argument we're trying to do is to push that to say that actually policing is inherently corrupt because colonialism is inherently corrupt, right? And so that's what we're trying to kind of get at there.
Wonderful. Thank you both so much. We have questions coming in. So I'm going to give you the first one from Dunya in Newcastle. Hello. She says, I'd love to hear more about resistance against police, both in the 30s and more recently. So whoever.
So Mónica, do you want to talk about our other case study that we look at?
Yes, Jesus. So what the kind of historical record shows is that police often kind of end up targeting certain communities, right? So this community that we're interested in our other example is called Barrio Africa. And it's in Guayama, which is, one of these former sugar sectors. And Barrio Africa, of course, by its name indicates that it's the area where Afro-descended Afro-Puerto Ricans live. And so this moment is revealed through these letters and these depositions that are sent to the Department of War, the Secretary of War, and complaining about the Puerto Rico police and basically saying, look, the Puerto Rico police has been harassing this community. They've been sexually abusing women here. They, have been beating us. And this is also this is at the end of the 1920s. And so this is the moment of prohibition. So there's this sort of outsized police presence in certain locations, right? Locations which are known to be sort of debauched and, repudiated or disreputable. And so these letters sort of reveal that for a long time, the police chief in particular has been perpetrating this kind of ongoing harassment and violence in the community. And so the letter writer writes to the Department of War because he doesn't believe that the police can investigate themselves, right? He's like, they won't investigate themselves. And there's lots of letters like this, lots of instances like this of people writing to the US government in the hopes that they can kind of move their complaints above the local order and outside of the scope of the local police who often sort of use their power to kind of get whatever they wanted, right? Whether that was personal or just power or just control. So instances like that are happening throughout the early 1900s, in the 20s and the 30s in particular. The other thing that happens in the 30s is that there's just kind of growing dissent and protest, political protests, pushing against US colonialism and extractivist plantation sort of logics. And those sorts of political mobilizations are heavily policed, and are often end in sort of violent breaking apart of protest. And so you definitely see the police force as a kind of as working in conjunction with the US kind of colonial project to keep not just labor in line, but political dissenters in line, through violence and force, and also through this like extensive surveillance network that is created in this early 20th century moment. And then I'll turn it to Marisol to talk about more contemporary stuff.
Yeah, and so I think, one of the things that we see is that there's been this like constant appeal on the part of civilians to have some kind of oversight or responsiveness to kind of the excesses of policing, right? And that have largely been unmet, right? I think what we've seen is a lot of kind of superficial kind of reforms, or kind of lip service. And this is what we kind of see in the other example that we bring up in our paper. But I think the thing for us to kind of keep in mind, right, is that resistance is constant, right? And I think that Puerto Ricans are very clear on what exactly the purpose of policing is, right? And I think there's a way in which the kind of early 20th century appears much more overtly politicized, right? And I think because it's targeting kind of nationalists and pro-independence leaders and stuff like that. But there's another way in which we can understand kind of the policing of drugs and of street crime as also similarly politicized, right, and serving a kind of similar purpose. And I think Puerto Ricans are very clear on that.
We had a question that was quite similar, because we have an anonymous question from somebody who's asking you to connect the 30s to modern campaigns such as Rosselló's Mano Dura contra el Crimen. I know, Marisol, you've worked on that in your book. I don't know if you wanted to add anything, but I think you've.
Yeah, I can add, which is just also to say that, I think what we see, right, is this kind of pattern of policing stepping in, right, really to act as this kind of glue that holds together these colonial relations, right? And I think that's what you see in the 1930s, and that's what you see under Mano Dura contra el Crimen in the 1990s under Rosselló. And for folks who are unfamiliar, right, what happens during the 1990s, essentially, in response to kind of increased drug crime, right, and kind of crime associated with the informal economy, the governor at the time, Pedro Rosselló, who was the dad of the ousted recent governor, right, he mobilizes the Puerto Rican National Guard as well as local police, and is in collaboration with a number of kind of federal law enforcement officials as well, to raid and occupy public housing, which they understand as the crux or as a criminogenic space, right? As this is where the crime is kind of coming from, right? And the kind of argument I make around that is that that's a political move that's about saying, like, there's an increase in the informal economy. There's a way in which the U.S. development model is not providing for Puerto Ricans. And so we get this kind of explosive informal economy. And instead of addressing what the root causes of that kind of turning to informal economy are, we see this kind of intense crackdown that the only thing that it does is actually deepen crime, deepen experiences of violence and harm, right, particularly for marginalized and vulnerable communities, right? And so there's a way in which kind of crime that's associated or policing that's associated with drug crime is not seen as politicized, right? It's seen as like, oh, well, that's very clearly crime, right? Whereas like these other things are criminalized, right? Whereas like that's political dissent that's criminalized, right? And so a part of that has to do with, I think, a kind of who's seen as like an innocent victim, right? And like how that has to do with race, right? So the fact that like pro-independence kind of organizing, although as Mónica highlights, right, is not entirely white, is very much historicized as white, right? And understood as being kind of more white in Puerto Rico, right? Whereas like crime associated with kind of the informal economy is understood as very Black, right? And very kind of poor and working class, right? And so there's different ways in which it's targeted, right? And this leads to this kind of idea that these are not the same thing and that these are not caused by similar kind of structural faults, right? Within the colonial capitalist system. And the kind of, you know, benefit, I think, to looking at policing in a long kind of durée is that you see that it's a pattern, right? It's responding to these kind of moments of crisis, right? That it becomes this kind of strategy for colonial crisis management, really, that's what the purpose of the police are. That's about maintaining a status quo and when possible, kind of facilitating that status quo, right? By enforcing order on whoever is causing the disruptions, right? And the people who are causing the disruptions are the folks who are the most likely to kind of experience them firsthand, right? So vulnerable populations, economically and racially marginalized populations, right?
Right. Now they're coming in fast, as tends to happen in the last 10 minutes of an hour. A number of people are asking about student protests and the role that these student protests in the 70s, you mentioned Cerro Maravilla at the beginning of your presentation, but what role do student protests then play within this history of policing that you guys are putting together?
Yeah, I mean, the 1930s are a moment of many sort of student-led protests, and the UPR becomes this, again, this very policed space because there is a lot of student activism. And some of it is interesting because some of it is very much sort of nationalist leaning, and some of it is actually against the Nationalist Party. So there's this interesting kind of moment of tension within the UPR itself and like the student body, those who, you know, are really sort of allied with nationalist rhetoric and the Nationalist Party, and those who are still in seeking independence and greater sovereignty, but sort of reject the practices of the Nationalist Party. And so it ends up being a very sort of tense space where the police are often present. And, you know, there are several moments in the 30s where the police actually close off the university because of fear of protest. Yeah, so in this moment, I think UPR in particular, right? There are many other universities and many other sort of student strikes that actually happen during this time period, but UPR becomes this kind of political nexus center.
And that's kind of what and I'll be brief because I know we have other questions, but that was the point I was going to make as well, right? The UPR becomes a kind of specific target for a lot of this policing precisely because of what was the imagined role of the UPR, right? And the UPR is kind of established as part of an Americanization mission, right? In Puerto Rico, right? It's about training kind of teachers for this Americanization mission. Obviously, the university undergoes these tremendous kind of transformations where it becomes about this kind of house of learning, right? And about these efforts, you know, thinking about Sandra Rosa's work on this, right? To kind of Puerto Ricanize the university in some ways, right? So the UPR becomes this kind of site of struggle through these moments of turbulence, right, within the U.S. colonial relationship. So we see the 1930s kind of emerging as one moment, the 1950s, and then the 70s, right? And we can think about the kind of more contemporary period where we have this moment of kind of intense debt colonialism, right, and austerity, and the UPR again emerging as this intense site of contesting kind of US colonialism and the kind of debt regime, the austerity regime, and then coming under intense kind of police scrutiny and violence, right? And that is a kind of policing that follows students on and off campus in various kind of ways, right? So I think that we kind of see a continuity that very much has to do with kind of the failures of the UPR to kind of do what it was intended to do, right?
That's great. Thank you. I'm going to put two questions together, which are a little bit different now. One is from Beth Colon saying, she's asking, wondering if you have found any evidence in the historical record of the 1930s that touches on women's roles within the Puerto Rican labor movement and how the state used police to oppress them specifically. And then we have another one, maybe you can take this at the very end, from Felix de Porto Bravo, asking for any further reading that you can recommend on this topic.
Yeah, thank you for that question. So one of my projects when I sort of entered the archives was really trying to find women within the historical record, and nationalist women in particular, but sort of, you know, political leaders and you know, not surprisingly, what we find, and not because they weren't there, right, but because the archive is constructed in a particular way, right? And the archive that I spent most time in was actually the U.S. archive, right? So the National Archives here. So what I was reading was, you know, had gone through several layers of mediation, right? There was a sort of translation. Everything that was produced in Puerto Rico had to be translated. And then, you know, mimeographed into like, I don't know how many parts of print. So that you know, I'd often see things in various sort of government agency records that had been copied. So, you know, all of that to say that what I was able to find was very much sort of, you know, mediated through all of these, through not just time and, you know, the archival process. And then I was looking at a lot of newspaper records too, to see, okay, you know, what is happening in Puerto Rico, what's being reported, who is involved. And, you know, obviously women were very much there, and in the Nationalist Party in particular, right? And we have several colleagues who are trying to uncover women within the nationalist movement. But, you know, I did not find a whole lot of sort of women as political leaders of labor in this moment. Not that they weren't there. I didn't, it's not something that I saw. And, you know, this 1930s moment in particular is very much a sort of big man history kind of moment. So you have these like outsized political leaders and activists who tended to be, you know, men. So I don't know, you know, it's not a great answer, but
Mónica, if I can jump in, we have with 1 minute. Yorel Melendez Vadillo is asking if you have found any sources documenting the collaboration between FLT labor organizers and insular police officials. And we'll take the further reading question at the end, the very last minute, 30 seconds.
I haven't, no, I haven't. What I found was a lot of sort of surveillance of the FLT, which is interesting, right? They are being surveilled just as much as any other. And what you see is that despite the kind of, there's very little trust between government and labor and political activists. Even when they appear to be working together, they are still being surveilled, and they are still being sort of, you know, there's still suspicion about what they actually want and what they actually believe and what they're actually willing to do. So that's a short answer.
And just for further reading, I'll recommend this great book that we use quite a bit in our paper, but Puerto Rico Under Colonial Rule, which is a kind of volume that deals with some of these questions around kind of surveillance and policing of particularly like independence movements, but political activists generally. And then there's another collection that's a little harder to find, which is Las Carpetas, which is specifically about the kind of creation of files and surveillance that you can find. It's a little harder, but you can find it online for sure. So
I muted myself. Thank you both so much, and thank you to our wonderful audience for these great questions. I am so thrilled to have had you here. I think you've opened up our eyes about such an important aspect of how colonialism happens, and you are doing incredible transhistoric work. I'm so looking forward to seeing how this collaboration continues. Anyway, everybody, thank you very much for coming. We hope to see you at our next event, which is just 2 weeks away. Please visit the Torch website, the Caribbean Studies Network under networks. Thank you very much, and I will see you soon.
Thank you.